Hey folks, thanks for watching. It's Tuesday, November 4th. I want to talk about a few things in this video. One, there is some snow potential, particularly across the upper Midwest. Eric kind of hinted at that yesterday, so we're going to dive into that. There's certainly some cold weather potential early next week. Very low temperatures, possibility through the Mississippi, Ohio Valley, and then frankly down through the southeast where that frost could creep a little bit closer to the Gulf Coast, potentially. We'll look at some of those models. And then we're going to look at the long range. Of course, Eric touched on this yesterday. I touched on this last week. I think I'm going to stick my neck out and say the atmosphere is telegraphing a few things. What I mean by that is it's not always the case where in the long range or like the subseasonal, and what I mean by that is like day 10 through day 30, that we feel as confident as we do now about the forecast. Now, could that come back to bite us and we get humbled? That's certainly a possibility. It's certainly happened before. In fact, in July and August, I didn't feel like a particularly talented meteorologist with respect to the 15 to 30 day temperature. But given that we're kind of transitioning into the winter pattern where the atmosphere gets a little bit more predictable, just statistically, and given some things that are aligning with respect to the MJO, climatology, looking at kind of the analog years, including the kind of weak La Nina years that Eric looked at last year, at least with respect to like late November and December, it's worth mentioning a little bit of a higher confidence forecast in that regard. But we'll break it down. We'll look at kind of the failure modes to that, and we'll see where that's going. I did want to start with this view today. This is looking at the jet stream. This is not current. This is actually from a month ago today. This is October 4th, and it looks very different from what we're looking at here this morning. And I brought it up because, it shows how much further you can get into the kind of seasonal pattern in just a month, even though October, still certainly in fall. And if you look at it, we have this kind of cutoff low over the four corners. If you remember, we kind of had a busy southwest kind of late in the monsoon season, maybe even after it. Ridge here over, well up into Alaska, kind of a weak trough here near the Aleutians, at least weak relative to the Pacific, and not seeing that good Pacific jet momentum. Well, a month later, and I'm going to take it not only a month later, but even a few days from now out to Saturday, and it's just a totally different ballgame with respect to the meteorology happening right now. Now, through the U.S., at least forecast for the Saturday, deep trough, not a cutoff. This is a deep trough. It almost extends the entire length of North America. Ridge here over the western coast of North America. Plenty of flow out of the Pacific, and that gives us a lot of weather to talk about in the forecast. Now, the reason I'm showing you it Saturday is because there's not too much happening right now. In fact, if I make this current, see much more zonal flow right now here this morning on Tuesday. As a result, not too much going on, save for, last night, maybe portions of the Northeast. But if you look to the Pacific here this morning, plenty of flow coming out of the Pacific trough here just off the West Coast. This is actually bringing some rain showers right now as I talk. This morning on Tuesday to the Northwest, including portions of California. So more weather to talk about here in the forecast, and I'm going to jump right into that initially, give like a flavor of that, and then I'll jump into the kind of the current weather, if you bear with me here. So let's get this jet stream forecast valid for, it's about 6 a.m. Tuesday here from the ECNWF. There's that trough that we talked about, that flow coming out of the Pacific, that zonal, that mostly straight west-east flow across the kind of Canadian-U.S. border. So play this forward. Trough comes on shore in the northwest here tomorrow. See ridging developing over the central U.S., warming temperatures here both today and tomorrow, and then on Thursday as well through the central U.S. Plenty of flow coming out of the Pacific. And then I'm going to take this all the way into Saturday. And now this takes us all the way into let's do Sunday evening. There's that deep troughs. There's that potential for cold weather, snow across the upper Midwest, lake effect snow, potentially, particularly in the eastern Great Lakes. We'll look at Michigan too. And, this jet stream, it's a simple concept, kind of big picture, and that the jet stream that is flowing between the warm air to the south of it, or what we call kind of equatorward, so toward the equator, and colder air to the north of it, or to the left of kind of if you were going with the flow. So we know with a strong jet stream here, you're going to have warmer air to the south of it, warmer air kind of coming in on the backside in the ridging, or warm here over the Atlantic, and much cooler air inside the trough, if you will. And so that makes an easy forecast for what the Midwest is going to be dealing with like Monday and Tuesday morning. It's going to be the cold air north or poleward of the jet stream here. That's kind of the skinny on how that works and how we read these with respect to temperature. Now, I'm going to play the forecast a little bit further out because there is that ridge. This is just as relevant as the trough and those cooler temperatures, because that ridge is going to be shifting across the eastern U.S. later next week, settling back into the central U.S., and then shifting back into the east. So this kind of progressive pattern where a few days before, on the 8th and 9th, we had a big trough here. We've replaced it with a ridge. Now we have a trough out west, more activity coming potentially for California in the forecast. And we have this nice kind of progressive pattern. The jet stream is coherent. It's easily identifiable. There's not these like little cutoff lows sneaking through. There's not a poleward branch and like a subtropical branch. It seems to be this nice kind of carousel of troughs and ridges, bringing differentiated weather to the U.S., much to talk about. And that's a change of pace from where we were in October with pretty persistent pattern. Now, part of that, Eric touched on this yesterday, the MJO has been active. So with an active MJO, you have plenty of forcing for Rossby waves, those trough ridge patterns, as I just mentioned, and it's continuing. So right now we're somewhere in phase 5, likely moving to phase 6 very soon, potentially moving all the way into phase 7, and then there's this question mark. I mentioned the failure modes in our forecast. The question mark, how we could get this wrong, is does this transition through 8 and 1 occur, or do we stall out here in 7 and 6? Now, if you remember from Thursday when I showed the same forecast, there were questions if we would even get well into 6 or 7 before crashing back to null space. And the MJO has consistently showed over the last 30 days or so that it's progressive. It wants to move through, phases 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, now maybe even 7, and it's done it pretty quickly. It hasn't lingered like it was doing earlier, in early October when we had a much different pattern to follow along with. Okay, now with respect to current weather that's happening now, I mentioned that kind of system moving out of New England, maybe even had like a potential weak tornado overnight in Rhode Island. Let's see, pull up those SPC reports and see if I saw something about that last night just before I went to bed. Yeah, number of wind reports there. I know those are hard to see on the screen here, but look at Rhode Island, just tons of little wind reports, almost focused right on the small state there, and maybe even getting into southern Mass as well. So little system that came through overnight, but otherwise those wind advisories continue today. And then wind advisories, high wind warnings, and even a flood watch for Northern California here this morning to keep an eye on. Winter weather advisory for western Montana, far north Idaho, and that's indicative of that trough that's moving onshore now. If we look at current temperatures here this morning, earlier we did have some frost and freeze risk for the south, but that started to wane here. As temperatures are back up into the high 30s now. We do have a few spots touching freezing here across the eastern Corn Belt, but largely warming up a bit here across this area. But like I said, early next week, with that trough coming in, the cool down is on its way. I mentioned that trough across the western U.S. If we just look at those surface level winds, boy, there's that big low pressure system. You can identify the cold front and that convergent wind here, and that's bringing that disturbed weather to the northwest here early this week. If we jump over and look at just the radar mosaic, you can see showers moving through Northern California, even getting into the Sacramento Valley, prompting those flood watches more so along the coast and the Klamath Mountains. Some showers moving through the Snake River Valley, eastern Washington, like the Palouse, even getting into central and eastern Montana as well. So plenty of flow coming this way, not only here this week, but later in the forecast too. We'll look at that in just a minute here. I do want to look at the temperature story because it's going to be abrupt. So I mentioned those waves coming through, that kind of progressive pattern. That means you're going to be warming up and then cooling down and then warming up in this kind of predictable, 4 to 8 day pattern. And we see that in the temperature forecast. So looking at the maximum temperatures here this morning, just for Tuesday, look at the highs getting all the way up toward 80s in the Central Plains, Southern Plains as well, and then 60s up through the Midwest into the 50s in the upper Midwest. So much, things are changing, in that 4 to 10 day period. We were cold over the weekend. Some of these areas now are warming back up. That continues on Wednesday. The West going cooler, New England staying cooler. Thursday, let's take this into Friday. Here comes that cold front as the system and that deep wave trough comes in. Cooler now on Saturday for the upper Midwest. Much cooler Sunday. Now that cold front really has that life all the way down into the Gulf Coast states. These are maximum temperatures down into the 40s across the Midwest, 50s and 60s across the Mid-South, and then really cratering Monday all the way through the eastern U.S., down even like in the 50s through the Carolinas as your daytime high, just 60s along the Gulf Coast states, even 70s in Florida, right? They'll be in parkas. And it's much more stark. This takes us to Monday. If we look over at those minimum temperatures, where no major frost and freeze risk, at least for sensitive areas now, except for like New England. On Friday night, getting down into the 20s. Upper Midwest starts cooling off on Saturday and Sunday. That cold front, somewhere here. By Monday, dropping all the way down into the Mid-South. See 34 here near Chattanooga, 33 in Nashville. This is Monday. 20s across the Midwest, deep freeze territory again for the central Corn Belt, maybe even the eastern Corn Belt. And then if I could take this into Tuesday morning, you'd see additional cooler temperatures moving all the way through the Carolinas as well. Now, the NDFD, the forecast I'm showing you here is from the National Weather Service. They're always a little bit more, cautious with these long-range forecasts. So what I mean by that is if, some of the models are showing 22 a week out, they're going to say maybe 25, 26. Some models are saying, 85, they might say 80. So there's a little bit more cautious. I like that about the NDFD, but it doesn't always show you the true potential of how deep that, low could get early next week. And if we look at just the ensemble probabilities of getting down toward that freezing line, this from the ECMWF ensemble, if we go out to November 11th, this is Tuesday of next week, you can see that 50% line getting near the coastal plain here through the Gulf Coast. Now, not getting all the way to the coastline except for parts of like New Jersey and New England, but you can see how far south that freezing line potentially getting, that 50% line somewhere in that lake where it transitions to that green color. So you can see where that freezing line getting closer to Tuesday, and I'll take it back. There's Monday morning, through the Mid-South Tennessee Valley. And this is just the ensemble. Again, the ensemble's not going to show you, at least the scenario that could be on the colder side. So if we look at some of the, just the operational models like the ECMWF, see, actually it's a much cooler forecast for Tuesday the 11th. Now, I do apologize. There's no numbers on the screen here. But if we look at the color bar, you can see as we get down into this like salmon color. So I'm just I'll contour this. This is where we get down to like 28, 27 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's getting pretty far south in some of these forecasts. Now that freezing line, somewhere it starts transitioning over to like that lighter blue, and you can see that's getting pretty far south on some of these models here. So definitely have to keep an eye out on a deeper frost risk toward the Gulf Coast, and then a deeper freeze risk a little bit further to the north of that. Now I did mention that progressive pattern. I want to look at this on the 500 millibar heights from the ECMWF. If we play this forecast forward, let's get this into tomorrow morning about the same time. That trough now coming on shore in the northwest. We'll look at the precipitation in just a second. Little clipper coming through. Eric talked about these yesterday here through the upper Midwest on Thursday and Friday. That's going to bring that initial cold front through, and then that deeper cold front coming in behind it with that next system right here coming through the Midwest on Saturday and Sunday. That's going to bring that snow potential to the upper Midwest. We'll look at in just a few slides here, and then helping to usher in those cooler temperatures all the way through the Mid-South and then over to New England on Monday and Tuesday. Play that forecast forward. Look at this ridge setting up across the Central. Much warmer now across the west. But now here comes our next trough. Still have that ridge mid next week. Cooler across the east. More precipitation chances for the west, maybe even Southern California, like the Central Valley. We'll have to look at that in the forecast. And now this ridge starts to transition east, so we get warmer late next week. Middle part of November across the central part of the country. And then that starts to transition. We're way out now to 10 days. And that starts pushing east. So we have this kind of, like I said, that progressive pattern where, 4 days before Thursday, we were talking about much cooler temperatures here, early next week, and now transitioning into a ridge and a relief from those temperatures. And now we have the trough out west, which we've replaced with the ridge that was there over the weekend. If we look at precipitation here, so this morning we mentioned the showers kind of falling across the northwest. I play this in through tomorrow morning as that trough comes on shore. Much better precipitation coverage now, even getting to like San Francisco, the Sacramento area, like Stockton and north, and then up into the northwest. Better precipitation coverage. And this some heavy rainfall at times here through the middle part of this week. Even now through Thursday, we're continuing those rain showers. There's that little clipper system that raced through, that initial one that's going to bring those temperatures down initially. Rain chances for Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, maybe a little bit of snow getting in here, certainly into Ontario. Not much with this initial round. That cold front moving through, bringing precipitation chances through the Appalachians. Some precip chances in the Mid-South that's relevant for some of the drought risks that we talked about. And then here comes that next clipper. This one doesn't look as impressive, but it's ushering in much cooler air versus the one before it. So that next low developing kind of west near like Quincy, Illinois. This is on Saturday. Moves through quickly through the Corn Belt. And now on the back side of this, at least from the east, seem to be trying to bring snow showers into southern Wisconsin, central Michigan, transitioning to like a lake effect snow event after that on Sunday. Now early Monday. And now you can see that lake effect snow machine bringing snow all the way through portions of the northern and eastern Corn Belt here, at least in the snow corridors. So areas kind of along that corridor like Mentor, Ohio, getting into northern Indiana. You can see some showers here getting up into the Appalachians as that flow goes over the higher elevations there, now into northwest Pennsylvania, Erie, PA, western New York as that system moves out. And then remember, we're warming up on the backside of it. Lack of precipitation behind the trough. There's that next potential for Southern California and the Central Valley getting out into late next week. So that ridge that developed early next week now being replaced by a trough. And I'm starting to get out of breath because I'm trying to track all these, quick pattern changes with respect to the weather for each different part of the country, given the kind of progressive pattern here. Now, if we sum this all up with respect to snowfall, of course, we're expecting Intermountain West snowfall. So you'll find at the upper elevations of the Cascades, like the Sierra Nevadas, if we take this forecast out 10 days, more snowfall there. But really keeping an eye on this corridor here, that Clipper track as it comes out of Alberta, where they get their name from. And we're seeing snow along those lake effect corridors, just like maybe flurries in through this area here. Can't rule out some like light accumulations in the Appalachians, and then more so for Eastern Canada as well. Now, the ECMWF not as bullish on snowfall as the GFS. So I'm going to switch over and show you that in a second here. And in fact, before I do that, let's play this back so we can at least watch this clip. This is Wednesday. Snowfall accumulating northern Alberta. Now Friday, here comes that track through Minnesota, central Minnesota, potentially seeing some accumulation here. Now Sunday, so central Michigan might get in on some of that backside snowfall. Can't rule out Madison getting some flurries. And then the lake effect picking up Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday as that flow comes over those warmer lakes here in fall. Now the GFS, if we go back to like Saturday, as that next low comes through. Oh, it's going to switch to the new model run there, so we'll let it do that. Let's do midnight, Monday morning. This is that low that comes through. It's a little bit stronger on the GFS, and so it brings a much better corridor for snowfall through northern Iowa, through like the northern Chicago metro area, through central Michigan. Forecasting anywhere between 4 to like 10, 11 inches of snow. I'm not buying this. I don't think that low is going to be strong and deep enough to put anything like this down. But it does show there is some potential for accumulating snowfall from northern Iowa through like central and southern Michigan through the weekend. I'll have to keep an eye on. This is kind of irrespective of the lake effect event that's going to come on the backside of that. So I'll let that play out. You can see some of that accumulate underneath that initial swath there. But we'll have to keep an eye on that. Like I said, I don't buy it right now. The ECMWF a lot lighter. Now, do I expect maybe some accumulating snow in this quarter here? Yeah, it's possible. I'm not expecting we get up toward like 6 to 10 inches. That would be pretty impressive. This all doesn't look too impressive on the 10-day precipitation anomalies except for the western U.S. So with those multiple chances for rainfall both this week and the middle part of next week, if we look out to the 10-day precip anomaly, that's really kind of the corridor we're focused on. That kind of snow alley, through the eastern Corn Belt, through portions of Michigan, northern Illinois, and northeastern Iowa. Can see some higher values there, but this area is staying dry. So those light showers we talked about, really, it's kind of it with respect to the forecast. And we're going to be keeping an eye on this area closely because of all the winter drought concerns that Eric and I have touched on as we've gone through this fall. So we transition into the long range. I mentioned at the beginning that MJO is moving in the forecast. So the question we have now, Eric talked about this extensively yesterday, is it going to continue to do so? And if we look at the forecast right now, this is just looking at the Hobmiller diagrams of the trade winds in the Pacific. And what do you mean by that is I'm looking at these easterly wind anomalies in the Central Pacific. This is going backwards in time. So this is November 4th today. If you go down, you're going forwards in time. You go back up, you're going back into what it was like in October. And we saw these easterly wind anomalies shifting. And if we draw this area of like convergence shifting toward the east, predictably, with that MJO progression through phases 5, 6, now trying to get into 7. You see that line. You'll notice that I can't draw that same line going out into the forecast. We're seeing, an easterly wind burst here, and then a lighter, easterly trade still trying to keep the MJO toward, this looks like phase 6, even struggling to get out into phase 7. That's a little bit inconsistent with the MJO forecast that has, progressing very quickly, at least right now, from the phase diagram into phase 7. I don't see a ton of support for that in the Hobmillers, and when those don't agree, that adds some uncertainty with respect to, are we going to get this big transition from phase 7 to 8 to 1? Now, if we use history as a guide, which we often do, persistence would say, well, activity is going to continue. But Eric mentioned yesterday that almost half of these MJO progressions fail to get east of the maritime continent, Indonesia. And this one right now shows at least promise historically, but not in the forecast. So difficult to say that we're going to transition easily from 7, 8, and 1 and get a ton of flow that continues across the west and into the central U.S., and we're going gangbusters all the way into December. But what we do have is decent support, I think, here that we're at least going to be in some sort of phase 6 or phase 7 through the middle to late part of November. Now, Eric talked about some of that potential yesterday, but I think with respect to the next 14 days, all we need to focus on is this kind of parade of troughs and ridges. And so if we look at the ECMWF ensemble, by this weekend, we mentioned the cold potential across the eastern U.S., brief ridging across the west. That transitions later next week to a trough across the western U.S., warm across the central U.S. as that ridge redevelops, shifts across the eastern U.S. We keep that trough over the Rockies by late next weekend. And then that starts to shift over the middle part of the country. This goes wetter. I think later into the forecast, this will take us all the way out into the early part of next week. Too far to put a pin in this with respect to the forecast. What I see here is, again, momentum out of the Pacific and this train that we keep moving now from west to east across the country. And if we look at the MJO historical analogs as a guide here, and we just look at like phase 6, if we're going to stay in that through, or phase 7 through the middle part of November, it tends to favor ridging in the western U.S., similar to what we've seen at times here, like late October, early November. And as we get further out into the forecast, we do see that troughing here next week. We mentioned the potential for Southern California to get rainfall late next week, but some potential for that ridging to redevelop and central U.S. troughing and behind that. And if I take this out to like early December, if we stay all the way in like phases 6 or 7, we actually start to develop more of that deeper trough potential across the central U.S., maybe even the eastern U.S. as we go further along in this pattern. Now, that relates to the forecast Eric and I have been talking about, whereas if you take the ECMWF weeklies, we play those out. These are just 7-day rolling 500 millibar height anomalies, so kind of the week-to-week trough pattern. All right, well, like late next week, and then looking to the week after, there's that ridge that comes in later in the forecast, that trough coming in for the western U.S. Just take the forecast out. All right, we go beyond that, November 25th through the end of December. That ridge returns back to the western U.S. There's that kind of analog I was talking about with phase 6, where the ridge returns back to the west. We get cooler in the east. You see that here. There's the cooler in the east. And then as we get into December, right, remember I showed that one as well. Let's take that phase 6 all the way into December, maybe even like phase 7 if we get that far. Much cooler across the central part of the country. And if we look at the weekly forecast, there's that almost lining up exactly with respect to that, historical analog that we looked at. So there's good support, I think, for this general train of troughs and ridges that eventually by the end of November transitions back toward ridging out west, cooler in the east, better lake effect snow potential. The failure mode here is pretty simple, and I mentioned it even a while ago at the beginning of this video, is if we get that big transition through phases 8 and 1. If we do that, and we just look again at history as a guide here through like the early part of December, let's go to like phase 1. Well, now we have flow coming all the way into California, all the way up into the central U.S. This is not really a proper ridge, just kind of a weak one. This would bring systems through the middle part of the country, potentially even have like severe weather to talk about further south, and that would be an interesting start to December, at least for the western U.S. But again, I don't see a ton of support for that in the long range. What I see more of, both in the long-range forecast for like the extended model that we just looked at, the ECMWF, some of our December analogs that Eric showed you yesterday, I think there's more support for a scenario like this, where as we transition into late November, early December, we're getting that kind of positive TNH pattern that we talked about earlier in October of cooler over Canada, better great lake effect snow season, at least in December, cooler temperatures spilling out into the central U.S., and we return back to a quieter pattern for December for California, which has some support as well in the kind of weak La Nina analog. So that's what we're looking at now. Neither of those scenarios play out, particularly well for the southeast. Obviously, I mentioned that severe potential if we transition through 8 and 1. That would probably be a little bit better to kind of break out of some of the drier weather there. But if you look at some of the long-range forecasts for the south, we have this chance when that trough moves in over the Rockies in the central U.S. in the middle part of November to get some rainfall in the southern Mississippi Valley. We'll have to see how that develops, because if we go further out into the pattern, that return back toward dry conditions with this pattern that we looked at comes back. And so that kind of seasonal drought risk remains across a wide swath of the south here. So we'll see what we can get into in mid-December. If we look at like the CPC By the way, if you do this, this is kind of a simple way to summarize what we talked about in this video. Look at the temperature, the ridging here, 6 to 10 days. Ridging moves out into the central U.S., 8 to 14 days. So that simple west to east movement. There's where we bring up some of those precipitation chances for the Mid-South. Now, if we look at 3 to 4, that ridging moves further toward the east, replace it with a trough of the west through the middle part of November. And then I think it's going to flip all the way back around. So that ridge will move east, we'll move another ridge in, and we'll go cooler and wetter in this corridor here. I think that's the skinny on what we're seeing here. And you can almost kind of see that. And if you go all the way to the December outlook, or the November outlook from the temperature. Progressive pattern right now. Eric will talk with you all tomorrow on Wednesday. If you made it to the end here today, thanks for watching.